All right, you good? Everybody can hear me? So I was kind of surprised when Brian asked me to present this. I wasn't sure how this would fit into this, but after listening yesterday, I actually see the wisdom potentially in that and some of the other ones. So I'm Ken Salchow. I do work for F5 Networks. We are a credential sponsor. However, this is actually more of kind of my personal journey and stuff, the things I'm interested in. It does relate. Uh, my life is nothing but a big circle. I keep redoing the same things over and over again. So um, we're going to talk a little bit about some potential changes or some ideas that might affect what we do from a credentialing standpoint. And it's all about using mental models for assessment. So I did want to kind of give a background on how this happened. Um, we've been evaluating human capability for centuries. If I remember correctly, psychometrics wasn't really a profession until the mid-1930s, early 1940s. Spearman created the general theory of intelligence, published in 1901. That's where IQ comes from. And his attempt in his paper was actually a compilation of decades of research in the 19th century, trying to consolidate them all together. Those are just the formal approaches. I'm sure prior to that, we had the guild systems that used ways of testing people to make sure that they had competency before they moved on to that. And I'm sure very likely, Grog wanted to know why, his next door neighbor was really good at picking berries or killing saber-toothed tigers, and trying to figure out who the best person was to do these things. So we've been doing this for a long time, but the challenge is that the results have been unreliable. They've been inconsistent. So one of the things, looking at research, things like IQ as a predictive measure really only accounts between 5 and 20% of actual real-world performance. That's not surprising because a lot of people don't realize that the IQ measure of general intelligence was a theory to define intelligence sans experiential knowledge. It was innate. Didn't care about anything you learned. They were trying to measure what your innate capability of being intelligent was. That doesn't predict how people are going to perform in the real world. So I'm not a psychometrician. I'm not a cognitive scientist. My degrees are in IT and business. So I come at this from a somewhat slightly different perspective than I think a lot of people in this room may have. But this idea of being able to identify high quality human capital, and I know that sounds impersonal, sorry, it's the business degree. But the idea of identifying high quality human capital is extremely important for business. It is, often people give lip service to the fact our people are our biggest assets. And they say it at cocktail parties, and most of the times I think when we talk to executives at corporations in the United States especially, they don't really mean it. They're more focused on other things, and they don't realize that it is absolutely true. The quality of the human capital in an organization is a key indicator of success. And it is very closely tied to the ability to do innovation. If you don't have high quality people, you cannot innovate. It does not happen. So that is my perspective on why I kind of got into this from my side. Now, yesterday, I threw some things up here. I think we talked about some of the things that come to this. We talked about things like the difference between minimally qualified versus expert. And we talked about the difference between prediction, well, we're trying to predict performance, versus what I think the problem is, because I have an engineering background and I like to look at the problem. We've been trying to predict future performance based on some mechanism of antecedents and knowledge, and we've been very unsuccessful. I've always thought that the approach that we should take is try to figure out what is expertise first. If we could define that somehow, then it would be easier for us to figure out how to get there. So the question that started my whole process here is, what is an expert? And is it something that we can define objectively? And if we can, then we can measure against it. So I started a little bit of research and looked at the fact that there is there's some basis for the fact that there is an objective measure of expertise. So the start of this is the whole idea of mental models. And I doubt anybody in here is not familiar with the concept of a mental model, not the typical audience that I usually talk to. However, the big thing here is the whole idea of, it goes back to Chase and Simon's chunking and sequencing theory. Everybody's familiar with chunking and sequencing. So the idea is that, a novice starts out with a sequence of events, and over time and experience, those sequence of events get chunked into smaller events that encapsulate other things. The idea came to me that in looking at the research, this is what we've been looking for. This is the tacit knowledge different from the explicit knowledge. We teach explicit knowledge, that's the sequence of events at the top. How that is organized is what we classify as tacit knowledge. That's why experts can't tell you the tacit knowledge they have, because it's encapsulated within this mental model. So that was the start of it. The next part was, is there a way to actually explicate and measure these mental models? And it turns out there is. There's actually several ways to do this. And on top of that, some of these comparisons of these mental models have shown that they are consistent. Specifically, you'll notice a reoccurring name up here on my citations. It's Dr. Thomas Schock. I love the fact that he's a German psychologist with the last name of Schock. I find that very funny and interesting. But Professor Schock is a sports psychologist. He also, oddly, works in robotics. And his entire process was this idea of, how can we explicate, how can we represent the mental models of sports, of athletes, and compare them? And he developed this SDAM, or Structural Dimensional Analysis of Mental Representations, which is a mouthful. My dissertation title did not fit on one line. In fact, it didn't even print fully on the spine. And all because of that. But what he was able to show is that with this methodology that he used, he can very accurately predict whether someone is an expert in a sport simply based on applying this little algorithm. And I'll go into a little bit more of that. But the idea is that an expert golfer taking their golf swing has, through experience, has created a mental model that is very efficient. Now, the benefit with Dr. Schock's study is that we're talking about biomechanics, and there are certain limitations to the human body. But taking that as a caveat, what he found is that regardless of how people learned how to do that golf swing, the mental models of experts all coalesced to a common point. There was a point that defined what an expert golf swing actually was. And this methodology allowed him to measure that. So my idea, because this was a tough sell in a business program, but my idea was to take this and apply this to to knowledge workers. So a little bit broader category, but it seemed that it should work, right? We're talking about the mental models, the experience, looking at tacit knowledge. So the way this works, this SDAM protocol, is you create a series of tasks or components, series of items, and you simply present them on the left-hand side there. You present them in order. The one at the top is the reference variable, and then the person taking the assessment simply takes the underlying task and says, is it related or not related? How do I feel about that object? Is it related or not related? And basically they swipe left or swipe right, which I think means I'm going to create a great app at some point. I'm thinking of calling it Minder. We'll see how that works, but the swipe left, swipe right, and basically they categorize all the tasks in relation to the primary task. Then the task at the top changes, and it becomes one of the other elements, and they do the whole thing again until they cycle through. There are multiple variants of this where you get multiple levels deep. Didn't want to go that far. It gets a little complicated, but you take the results of this and follow the math that was on the previous page, which is also above my head, I will totally admit. Interestingly, though, one of the primary components of this is cluster analysis, which for anybody who in here who has followed big data, cluster analysis is getting a big rebirth and a resurgence in popularity because of what it does. I thought it was interesting. I actually had to figure out how to do cluster analysis to do this. The results when I did this with my study was that you get these dendrograms. So if you look back, I had objects 1 through 11, and they were in sequence of 1 through 11. And these are examples of some of the participants. So over here you get what we call an invariant model. If you notice, those sequence of events that are actually pretty straightforward. They're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 mostly through that. But the bigger thing is that of all these objects, these two individuals, anything below the line is a single cluster or a group. So those two individuals that have those invariant models, they've taken all those 11 objects and they've really broken them down into 2 major components of the process. And then those components are then broken down into other things. There are some minor variations, but the way that this process works is it looks at how, it's a cluster analysis. It's looking at how related those clusters are. Comparing that, this is the novice. This is someone who does not have a whole lot of experience in that process. And you can see, if you look at where the gray line is at, this guy's getting pretty close. He's got 4 instead of the 2. This one's a little bit further away. Needs a little bit more experience to drive the development of that model. So my results were not perfect. So it had some challenges. We had some misidentifications of experts, of novices as experts, based on incorrect task. Looking over here, I found that someone's level of invariance, how closely they related to that coalesced expert model, had more to do with industry experience than the specific job function. I did a little bit more research. The task that we were doing was supposed to be a technical troubleshooting process. But after this result, I kind of looked at the items in that list and realized that if I removed some of the technology words, what we were really looking at is a customer service function. So because I was being a scientist, I had my wife take the same process. I kind of explained the technology words into what she does. She spent 20 or 30 years in retail. And I had her do it, and her model came out as an expert model. So I think there's some validity in what it was. The problem with my study was I picked people based on expert or novice based on their technology experience, and then I compared them on their customer service skills, which is probably not a valid interpretation of this expert. So the model actually creates the clusters itself, and you get an invariance measure. If the invariance measure is above 0.68, it's considered statistically relevant. And I did not develop the software. I licensed the software actually from Dr. Schock. I love it. One of the other problems I noticed is that we also had the misidentification of an expert as a novice, because his job role was actually different. He was a mentor to other technicians. And so some of the processes for him were different, and they took place in a different. His customer service experience was actually providing service to the person giving service to the customer. And so consequently, his particular mental model was very different from the standard one. Therefore, that didn't work either. So the end result is that, the conclusion here is, I think this works. I was able to take a set of people. I was able to differentiate their mental models, show which ones had expert levels of experience at this particular task. The challenge I have is in creating the task. I have conducted a follow-up study where we use component analysis instead of task analysis. So instead of decomposing a task and asking people to do it like a golf swing or a tennis swing, looking at components that they would use to create a solution or to a part of what they do. I haven't finished analyzing those results yet. So. It's possible. It's going to take a lot of research. But one of the things, going back to what we've been talking about the past couple of days, is this is where earlier I said wearables is a technology that I'm more interested in, because to me, that data on a knowledge worker or an industrial worker or whatever, being able to monitor what they do during the day may help us isolate the particular components that are necessary to isolate whether they're an expert or not. In addition, big data. The neat thing about this process is that instead of going out and trying to define what expertise is, we're allowing the expert's mental models to show us what expertise is. Well, that means that big data can be a great thing. That's why I'm talking about building the app, where we can put out something that says, well, this is a mental model for X. If you want to do it, and swipe left, swipe right, and then take the data back, helping us define what an expert model is. And ultimately, I want to be able to use this as both a measure of whether someone has achieved expertise in whatever field it is that they're doing, but there's also a lot of study that shows that this can help in education. So one of the studies that Dr. Schock and his colleagues had done was actually they compared the mental models of novices prior to taking an educational course. Then they actually had 2 different educational courses, one focused internally and one focused externally. I think Dr. Schock plays a lot of golf, because golf is a lot of their studies. This particular one was actually with putting. And the only difference between the 2 classes of students was that one class with an internal focus was taught to focus on how they swung, how they stood, how they did everything about themselves. The other group was an external focus. They were focused on how they did hitting the hole. Don't worry about this, worry about that. And remarkably, they found afterwards, they redid the study and compared, and they showed that the people who were externally focused, their mental models actually progressed greatly towards an expert model, and the ones that were internally focused had absolutely no difference whatsoever. So again, it might be a tool for us to also evaluate things like adaptive learning or just our courses, be able to do that agile development for education, where we can take an experiment, we can try 2 different ways of teaching something, whether it's online or in person or whatever, and possibly give a way to objectively measure which way of teaching is better for those particular people. No, because I'm still waiting for, full disclosure, I did actually do my dissertation research at my employer. And so they are very tightly tied together. The troubleshooting process was done with people who may or may not have certification at our company. Because I haven't isolated that exact component, that task or the pieces that I think are going to let me do that, I haven't gotten to the point of comparing it, but that would be ideally the next step. Then I just have to worry about whether it shows me that my certification is crap. I mean, yeah, it's great to know. It's just, not exactly the outcome. could be, either way, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Well, I'm not hoping. I'm using a lot of people much smarter than me to suggest that the development of that expert mental model is the tacit knowledge that's implicit in creating performance. You're talking about validity. How do I measure the validity of? Mhm. So that's the validity part that's going to be difficult when we talk about knowledge work, and I'll fully admit that. The work that they've already done in sports um, was pretty easy to do. One thing that you don't get in knowledge work that we deal with all the time, right, is a clear distinction between expert and novice. When they were doing studies on tennis players, they were doing internationally ranked players versus beginners or high school players. They had very easily definable strata on which to sample, and the results are they're 100% accurate. I mean, they can tell you. Interestingly, with volleyball players, they could even decompose the task, and they could look at that and tell you the difference between a short spiker and a long spiker based on the sequence of the actions. They both had expert mental models, but the sequences were different based on which position they played. So from a sports standpoint, whether that swing looks ugly to you or not is not necessarily the difference. They've demonstrated that in sports where it's easy to do this, it works. And that's the premise I'm going on. For this, we're going to have to do validity studies all over the place. I'm trying to chase a definition of expert performance, because without knowing what we're looking for, it's hard to figure out how to predict it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm trying to give you a tool to hire experts, not. Mhm. Mhm. But again, it's the performance is in how that knowledge is done used, not the knowledge itself. So the role that we were using for my study is customer service. It's not really physical. It was the mental aspects of it, and I think that's the challenge when I go back to stratification. Um, I also had some. I'm sure a few people in here have had that, but the institutional review board did not particularly care for me to ask people who were experts. I fought. They told me to use an objective measure, which I explained to them was exactly the point of the study because there ain't one. But um, so even in my dissertation study, I was limited in what I could do. Now that I'm not affiliated with an institution of higher learning, I can do whatever I want. Well, within reason, but so I'm hoping that we can do that, because the research says that asking peers who an expert is a perfectly valid way to identify experts, and I wasn't allowed to do that. So I mhm. So and I always and apparently it's unusual, but it's knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes. It's KSAOs, because there's um, values, um, personality. There's a lot of other stuff that can affect that as well. But yeah, it's similar to that. So the interesting thing about this from the sports that I just loved, and I kind of latched onto, was the idea that you can tell if someone's a professional, a high-performing athlete based on the analysis of a single function. They didn't analyze every aspect of a tennis player. They analyze their serve based on that serve. The ballet dancers, they did 2 ballet movements. And with those 2 ballet movements, they could place someone anywhere from a professional dancer down to a 5-year-old, starting class. So it was the idea that one component of being an expert was able of predicting full expertise, which makes this a simple process. I'm not convinced that that's going to work in knowledge work. So if you look at practice, what they do, I think we may have to take a look at multiple pieces. Going back to my dissertation, while I ended up doing an evaluation of customer service, is customer service not something that we probably want a support person to know? It probably is. So maybe that's a component. Maybe we have more than one of these things that we evaluate on. But the benefit could be great. You can't cheat on this, right? This is a test you can't cheat on. I'm asking you, do you think this is related to the other one or not? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer. Either you do or you don't. And oddly enough, I was having a conversation with someone. If someone were to coach somebody else about whether things were related or not related, it would be interesting, but could they adjust that person's mental model and actually teach them to be an expert by telling them what is related and not related, helping them develop that model? I don't know. Theoretically. No. It will find clusters, but whether those clusters, how many of those people and whether those clusters relate or not, it doesn't seem to show up. Mental models that are unclustered seem to not have any kind of relation to each other. And again, I totally will tell you, remember, business major. So the SDAM, it's actually one of the reasons why I want to build an application that does this, and I've actually been investing my time in learning R and doing some statistical analysis myself. Is I'm trying to better understand what that model is and how it works. But at the same time, I want to continue to evolve and look at this. So, well, and the thing is though yeah. So again, in sports, they can just give it to, so they did kind of the reverse aspect of it. They gave it to a bunch of people. They let the model calculate what it believed to be the expert model. And then they went back who fell into that, and it was correlated. So the people who fell into that unique model were all the experts, and those who fell out were those who weren't. So there's suggestion, and that's what I find is exciting about this. A lot of the other stuff we've done to measure tacit knowledge is the first step that they always do is they ask experts what tacit knowledge they have, which is the antithesis of tacit knowledge. You can't tell people what tacit knowledge is. That's how it's defined, is that you can't tell it. You can't show somebody that. It's just something you have. So when you start out to test for tacit knowledge and you ask experts what their tacit knowledge is, I think there's some issues of validity right there. They don't know what it is that they do that makes them an expert, so asking them to define it is kind of hard. And I have that question every time we do a test design workshop or an IDW, and we do the same thing with SMEs. We're asking them what knowledge makes them experts. And in the back of my mind, I keep thinking, well, they can't really tell us. They can tell us what knowledge pieces they need to have, but they can't really tell us how to be an expert. And yet, and yet somehow our brains go from learning day one, learning to walk, you know, and then eventually we build a model that allows us to adapt to changes in that. We don't get to problem solving just because we're fed knowledge. We get to problem solving because we've applied a model, a mental model that we view of the world. It doesn't work. Now we have to adjust that model, and then our models change and learn, and eventually they become a mental model that allows us to do problem solving. That's kind of the idea behind trying to identify this. Don't know if it's going to work. I did say, lifetime of research. Usually I only say 20 years. I figure I'll get bored after 20 years, but yeah. Mhm. So I don't think the whole thing is in the model, right? Because that shows how people are structuring that knowledge, and that indicates that they've developed a certain level of performance and expertise, but I don't know that it still tells us how they specifically apply that. Also, this is the mental model of a single task or a single component. And in my view, the capability of being innovative isn't just having a single model, it's having multiple models and being able to see the characteristics that are similar to those models. I've done this throughout my career. Well, I did that for here, which is, hey, this seems familiar. I've done this something similar over here when I did this job, and what if we apply that? And I think that's where innovation comes from, is seeing the unique, the same trees in a different forest kind of thing. All right. Well, thank you.